The mud in Pine Hollow was not merely dirt and water. It was a living, sucking thing that aimed to pull the righteous and the wicked alike down into the earth. It was November of 1878, and the sky above the Wyoming Territory hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of a winter that the old-timers predicted would be a butcher. But in the tight-packed cluster of clapboard buildings and false front stores that made up the town, the cold in the air was nothing compared to the chill in the eyes of its citizens. Pine Hollow prided itself on morals. It was a place where the church bell rang strictly on the hour, where men removed their hats when a lady passed, and where cruelty was practiced with a terrifying, polite precision. It was a town where a reputation could be murdered faster than a man in a saloon fight, and with far less blood to scrub away afterward. Lydia Hart sat on a hard wooden chair in the center of the church vestry, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were the color of old bone. She was 22 years old. Though the last month had aged her spirit by a decade, she was slender, with hair the color of dried wheat pulled back severely, a style that suited her reputation as the schoolteacher's daughter. Since her father had passed and her mother had succumbed to the fever 2 years prior, Lydia had survived by taking in sewing. She was known to be quiet, careful with her coin, and possessed of a pride that some of the town wives found irritating. Lydia Hart did not gossip, and she did not flirt to get a better price on flour. That pride was currently being stripped from her, layer by layer. Standing before her were the pillars of Pine Hollow. Reverend Josiah Higgins, a man whose jowls shook when he spoke of hellfire. Sheriff Barron, who wore his badge like a shield against his own corruption, and Samuel Clay, the son of the town's wealthiest cattleman. Samuel stood by the window, refusing to look at Lydia. A week ago, he had cornered her in the alley behind the millinery shop as she was delivering a finished dress. He had smelled of bay rum and stale whiskey, and his hands had been wet and grasping. When Lydia had fought him off, striking his cheek with the wooden handle of her parasol and fleeing into the dark, she had thought the horror was over. She had been naive. The next morning, the Reverend's wife had whispered to the baker that she had seen Lydia luring Samuel into the shadows. By noon, the story was that Lydia had tried to seduce the boy for money. By supper, the accusation had evolved. The church donation box, kept in the vestibule, was reported missing. It had contained nearly $40 intended for the orphanage in Cheyenne. "I did not take it," Lydia said, her voice trembling but audible. "And I did not tempt him. He attacked me." Reverend Higgins sighed, a sound of immense, staged disappointment. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at her as one might look at a lame horse that needed to be put down. "Miss Hart," the Reverend said, his voice dripping with honeyed poison, "we have the testimony of upstanding members of this flock. Samuel has confessed to his weakness in being led astray by your financial desperation. The box is gone. Your debts at the general store are known to be high. The arithmetic is simple, even for a seamstress." "My debts are $5, Lydia argued, her eyes stinging. "I would never steal from God." Sheriff Barron stepped forward, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. "We found the lock on the vestibule broken, Lydia, and we have witnesses who saw you leaving the church late." "I was cleaning the pews for extra credit at the store." "Lies do not become a lady," the sheriff said flatly. "Now, the council has discussed this. We have no desire to see a woman of your father's lineage hang for theft, nor sit in a cell with common drunks. We have come to a benevolent solution." Lydia looked up, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "Solution? You will work off the debt," the Reverend announced. "The $40 stolen, plus the damages to the church door, and a fine for the moral disturbance. Let us call it $100. $100 was a fortune. It would take her years to earn that with a needle and thread. There is a need for a housekeeper up in the high country," the Reverend continued. "Caleb Rourke has sent word to the trading post that he requires assistance through the winter. The council has generously agreed to advance your wages to the church to cover the theft. You will go to Rourke's cabin and work until the contract is satisfied." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. even in town. The name Caleb Rourke was spoken in low tones, usually to frighten children. He was a mountain man, a trapper who lived near the timberline where the air was thin and the law did not reach. Rumors swirled around him like flies on a carcass. They said he was half wild, that he had killed men with his bare hands, that he spoke to wolves. He came down only twice a year to trade furs, a giant of a man who looked through people rather than at them. "You are sending me to the mountain?" Lydia whispered. "Alone, with a man like that?" "It is honest work," the Reverend said, his eyes hard, "unless you prefer the county jail in Laramie." Samuel Clay finally turned from the window. He looked at Lydia, and for a second, she saw a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly swallowed by the arrogance of a man who knew his father owned the very ground the church stood on. He said nothing. "Pack your things, Miss Hart," the sheriff said. "You leave at dawn." The journey was a slow execution. The wagon driver, a sour old man named Elias, who had been paid $5 to transport her, spoke not a word for 6 hours. The road wound upward, leaving the muddy slush of the valley for the hard-packed frost of the foothills. The air grew thinner, biting at the inside of Lydia's nose. She wore her best coat, but it was wool worn thin at the elbows, insufficient for the elevation. Beside her on the buckboard seat was a small carpet bag containing 2 dresses, her sewing kit, a Bible she had not opened since the trial, and a small sack of cornmeal she had hidden in her pocket. She also carried marks she refused to look at, a dark bruising on her upper arm where Samuel had grabbed her, a scrape on her shin from where she had fallen against a crate escaping him, and deeper than those, the invisible mark of the town's rejection. They had discarded her. They had chosen to believe a lie because it was easier than confronting the truth of their own sons. Around 2 in the afternoon, the wagon stopped. Elias pointed his whip toward a narrow game trail that vanished into a dense stand of lodgepole pine. "Trail gets too narrow for the wheels here," Elias grunted. "Rourke's place is 3 miles up. Keep the creek on your left. Don't stop moving, or the freeze will take you." Lydia looked at the dark forest, then back at the man. "You are leaving me here?" "I was paid to bring you to the pass. This is the pass." He spat tobacco juice onto the snow-dusted rock. "Get out!" Lydia climbed down, her legs stiff. She barely had her grip on her bag before Elias snapped the reins and turned the wagon around, eager to be back on level ground before nightfall. The sound of the wheels fading away was the loneliest sound Lydia had ever heard. She turned to the mountain. It was vast, silent, and indifferent. The wind did not howl. It hissed through the pine needles, a sound like knives being sharpened on stone. She began to walk. The first mile was difficult. The second was agony. The incline was steep, and the ground was a treacherous mix of loose shale and patches of slick ice hidden beneath a dusting of snow. Lydia's boots were made for schoolrooms and church floors, not for the savage geography of the Rockies. Her breath came in ragged gasps that burned her throat. She fell twice. The second time, she scraped her palms raw on granite, but she scrambled up instantly, panic flaring in her chest. The shadows were lengthening, stretching out like blue fingers across the snow. To stop was to die. The sheriff had watched her leave with a look that suggested he did not expect her to come back. If she died up here, buried in a drift, the town would shake its heads and say it was God's judgment on a sinner. "I will not give them that satisfaction," she thought, the anger burning hotter than the cold. "I will live, just to spite them." She forced one foot in front of the other. The trees grew thicker, ancient giants that blocked out the fading sun. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to crush a person. It felt judgmental, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to fail. Then she smelled it. Wood smoke. She crested a ridge and saw it, tucked against a sheer wall of gray stone, sheltered by a grove of spruce. Sat a cabin. It was rough-hewn, built of logs as thick as a man's waist, chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney released a thin, white thread of smoke into the twilight. A lean-to on the side sheltered a stack of firewood and a dark shape that looked like a mule. Lydia smoothed her wind-tangled hair, though she knew it was hopeless. She gripped the handle of her bag until her fingers ached. She walked across the small clearing, her footsteps crunching loud in the quiet, and climbed the 3 steps to the porch. She knocked. The sound was small, swallowed instantly by the vastness around her. She waited. No sound came from inside. She knocked again, harder this time. Heavy footsteps vibrated through the floorboards. The latch lifted with a metal clack that sounded like a gunshot. The door swung inward. Caleb Rourke filled the doorway. The rumors had not done justice to the sheer size of him. He was well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked out the warmth of the fire behind him. He wore buckskins that were stained with grease and pine pitch, and a heavy flannel shirt that had once been red but was now a faded rust color. His hair was long, tied back with a leather thong, and his beard was a thicket of dark brown covering half his face. But it was his eyes that stopped Lydia's breath. They were dark, set deep beneath a heavy brow, and they held absolutely no warmth. They were the eyes of a man who had looked at the world, found it wanting, and turned his back on it forever. In his right hand, resting easily against his thigh, was a Sharps rifle. He did not raise it, but he did not lower it either. He looked at her. He took in her torn hem, the mud on her coat, the way she was shivering uncontrollably. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where her sleeve had ridden up, exposing the purple bruise Samuel's fingers had left. Lydia looked back. She saw the grit under his fingernails and the gray hairs scattered in his beard. She saw that he did not leer. He did not look at her with the hungry, predatory glint she had seen in the men at the saloon or in Samuel Clay's eyes. He looked at her as if she were a wounded animal, assessing whether she was worth the bullet to end her misery or if she would simply die on her own. "You're late," he said. His voice was like rocks tumbling in a dry creek bed, low, rough, and unused to speech. Lydia blinked, the absurdity of the comment nearly making her laugh. "The driver dropped me at the pass," Caleb grunted. He stepped back, leaving the door open, and turned away. It was an invitation, or perhaps just a lack of interest in stopping her. Lydia stepped over the threshold, and the warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of wood ash, cured leather, and strong coffee. The single room was sparse but orderly. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner covered in furs, and shelves lined with tins and tools. Caleb leaned the rifle against the wall and turned to face her. He crossed his arms. "Town sent word a woman was coming to work off a debt. Didn't think they'd send a child." "I am 22, Lydia said, her voice sounding thin in the heavy air of the cabin. She set her bag down, her legs trembling now that she had stopped moving. "And the debt is a lie, but I am here to work it off." Caleb's jaw tightened beneath his beard. He looked at the paper she pulled from her pocket, the contract the Reverend had drafted. He didn't take it. "I don't read contracts from Pine Hollow," Caleb said. "And I don't own people." Lydia froze. "I don't understand." "You can leave any time you want," he said, turning to the stove to pour coffee into a tin cup. "Door's unlocked." Lydia looked at the heavy door, then at the dark window where the night had fully descended. The wind was picking up, howling around the corners of the cabin. "Leave?" she repeated, a hysterical edge creeping into her tone. "Go where? There is nothing out there but snow and wolves. I have no money, no horse, and the town will not take me back." Caleb turned, cup in hand. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, "I guess you are staying." He set the cup on the table and pushed it toward her. "Drink. You look like you're about to fall over." Lydia took the cup. Her hands shook so badly that coffee sloshed over the rim, scalding her thumb. She didn't flinch. She drank the bitter, black liquid, feeling the heat spread through her chest. "There is a loft," Caleb said, pointing to a ladder bolted to the wall. "You sleep up there. I sleep down here. I go out to the trap line before dawn. You keep the fire banked and the water bucket full." "I can cook," Lydia said quickly, desperate to prove she was not just another mouth to feed. "And I can mend." I see your shirt has a tear at the shoulder. Caleb glanced at his shoulder as if he hadn't noticed. Suit yourself. He walked to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed and opened it. He pulled out a quilt. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the rough surroundings. A double wedding ring pattern, stitched with care in blues and creams, though the fabric was faded with age. He walked over and held it out to her. Take this. It gets cold in the loft. Lydia hesitated. Is this? It's warm, he said, cutting her off. His voice had a finality to it that warned her not to ask more. Lydia took the quilt. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that had no business being in this cabin. She climbed the ladder, her legs screaming in protest. The loft was small, warm from the rising heat of the fire. There was a straw tick mattress on the floor. She laid down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Below, she heard Caleb moving around, the scrape of a chair, the clatter of a pot, then the blowing out of the lantern. Darkness swallowed the cabin, save for the orange glow of the embers in the hearth. Lydia stared up at the rough beams of the ceiling. The adrenaline of the journey faded, leaving behind a crushing weight of grief. She thought of her father's schoolhouse. She thought of the little room behind the dress shop where she used to live. She thought of the way the Reverend had looked at her, like she was something spoiled. She bit her lip to stop the sound, but the tears came anyway. Hot, silent tears that tracked into her hair. She buried her face in the quilt that had belonged to a dead woman, trying to muffle her jagged breathing. Below, in the dark, Caleb Rourke lay on his back, his eyes open. He heard the soft, stifled sounds from the loft. He knew the sound of a person trying not to break. He had made those sounds himself, night after night, for 3 years. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort. He simply lay there, listening, keeping watch over the grief of a stranger because he knew that sometimes being heard was the only thing that kept a human being tethered to the earth. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm born of necessity. The sun rose late over the ridge, casting a pale, watery light through the single window. Caleb was always gone before Lydia descended the ladder. She found tasks to fill the terrifying silence. She swept the rough floorboards until her arms ached. She found the flour barrel and waged war against the mice that tried to nest in the corner. Stuffing the cracks with steel wool she found in a tin, she hauled water from the creek, which required breaking the ice with a heavy rock. The first time she carried the buckets back, she slipped, spilling half the water and soaking her skirts. She sat in the snow and cried for a full minute, then stood up, refilled the buckets, and walked back with a grim determination. When Caleb returned in the evenings, he brought the smell of cold air and musk with him. He would drop a brace of rabbits or a string of beaver pelts by the door. Their interactions were sparse, constructed of nods and grunts. But Lydia began to notice the small things. On the second night, she was cutting potatoes at the table. Caleb came up behind her to reach for a spice tin on the shelf. His shadow fell over her, and Lydia flinched violently. Dropping the knife, her hands flew up to protect her face, a reflex honed by the memory of Samuel Clay in the alley. Caleb froze. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move closer. He waited until she lowered her hands, her face burning with shame. I am not going to hit you, he said. His voice was flat, stating a fact like he was stating the weather. I know, Lydia whispered, picking up the knife. Then don't drop the knife, he said. It dulls the blade. From then on, she noticed that he moved differently when he was near her. He made his footsteps heavier so she would hear him coming. He avoided sudden motions. He never stood between her and the door. It was a strange, silent courtesy from a man who looked like he could wrestle a bear. On the 4th afternoon, the weather turned. The sky bruised purple and black, and the wind began to scream. Storm's coming, Caleb said, walking in early. He carried a massive armload of firewood. Big one. We won't be opening the door for 2 days. He dumped the wood by the hearth and began to secure the shutters. Lydia helped him, her fingers numb as she latched the heavy wood. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the world outside erased by a curtain of driving white snow. That evening, the fire roared, fighting back the chill that tried to seep through the logs. Caleb sat by the fire, greasing his traps. Lydia sat at the table, mending the tear in his flannel shirt. Restless. Lydia stood up to stretch. Her eyes caught a small shelf in the corner, shadowed and half hidden by a hanging pot. There was a stack of letters there, tied with a blue ribbon. Without thinking, she reached out. The handwriting on the top envelope was delicate, feminine, to my Caleb. Don't! The word was sharp, cracking through the room like a whip. Lydia snatched her hand back as if burned. She turned to find Caleb watching her, his face hard, the grease rag clenched in his fist. "I'm sorry," she stammered. I was just looking. "Those aren't for you," he said. The anger in his voice wasn't hot. It was old and deep. "I know," Lydia said, her voice steadying. "I respect that. I won't touch them again." She didn't retreat to the loft. Instead, she walked to the wash basin in the corner. She needed to do something with her hands. She rolled up her sleeves to scrub the potato starch from her fingers. The firelight caught the side of her arm. The bruise on her wrist had bloomed into a sickly yellow-green, but the shape was still distinct. 4 fingers and a thumb, printed into her skin. She stared at it, the water dripping from her hands. She felt the shame rising again, the voice of the town telling her she was ruined, that she was unwanted. She didn't hear Caleb move. She only realized he was there when his reflection appeared in the dark window glass above the basin. He was standing a few feet away, looking not at her face, but at her arm. He stared at the mark for a long time. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. "That's not from work," Caleb said quietly. Lydia looked down into the water. "No? A man did that?" "Yes." Caleb shifted his weight. "The boy?" "Yes. And the town blamed you for it." It wasn't a question. Lydia turned to face him. She saw something shift in his eyes. The cold distance was cracking, revealing a dark, smoldering anger. But this time, the anger wasn't directed at her. "They said I tempted him," Lydia said, lifting her chin, refusing to cry. "They said I stole from the church. They sent me here because they didn't want to look at me anymore." "Sssss." Caleb looked at the bruise, then up to her eyes. He saw the fear she was trying to hide, and the steel spine that kept her standing upright in a cabin at the end of the world. "They didn't just send you away," Caleb said, his voice low, vibrating in the small room. "They threw you to the wolves to save their own skins." He walked back to the fire and threw a log onto the grate with a violence that made sparks fly up the chimney. He stood with his back to her, watching the flames devour the wood. "You're safe here, Lydia," he said, using her name for the first time. "The storm will pass, but until it does, no one is coming up that mountain, and no one is dragging you down it." Lydia stood by the basin, holding her own wrist. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, burying the cabin in snow. But for the first time since she had left Pine Hollow, the cold didn't feel like it was inside her. She looked at the man's broad back, silhouetted against the fire, and realized with a jolt of surprise that she believed him. Winter arrived in the high country not as a season, but as a siege. The snow ceased to be a weather event and became a geography of its own. It drifted against the north wall of the cabin until the logs disappeared beneath a white, undulating wave that reached the roof line. The wind was a constant, screaming presence, a voice that tore through the pass with a sound like tearing metal. At night, the temperature dropped so low that the trees cracked like rifle shots, the sap freezing and expanding in the dark. Inside the cabin, the world shrank to the radius of the heat thrown by the stone hearth. Lydia Hart's body began to remember what it was like to be fed. The hollows in her cheeks filled slightly, and the trembling in her hands when she lifted the heavy iron skillet began to steady. The bruises on her wrist faded from purple to a sickly yellow, and finally to a pale shadow that only she knew was there. But while her flesh knitted itself back together, her mind remained a landscape of broken glass. The nightmares did not come every night, but when they did, they were vicious. Lydia would wake in the loft, her body rigid, her breath trapped in a throat that felt like it was closing. In the dream, she was back in the alley behind the millinery shop. The smell of stale whiskey and wet wool was suffocating. She could feel the rough brick against her spine and the weight of Samuel clay pressing the air out of her lungs. She would sit bolt upright in the pitch black, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, waiting for the heavy hand to clamp over her mouth. She never screamed. She had learned, somewhere in the terrifying silence of that alley, that screaming did not stop men who felt entitled to take. Down below, Caleb Rourke would wake the moment her breathing changed. He was a light sleeper, a habit carved into him by years of sleeping in country where a snapped twig could mean a grizzly or a hostile party. He would hear the sharp intake of breath, the rustle of the straw tick as she drew her knees to her chest. He never called out to her. He never climbed the ladder to offer a soothing hand. He knew, with an instinct that bypassed logic, that a man's touch in the dark was the very thing she was fleeing. Instead, Caleb would throw off his furs and move to the hearth. He would stir the embers with the iron poker, the metal scraping stone with a deliberate, grounding rhythm. He would add a log, the wood thumping solidly into the grate. He would pour water from the kettle, the sound of the liquid splashing into a cup loud in the quiet room. He made noise. He made himself known. He let the sounds of domestic survival fill the terrifying void of her panic. Up in the loft, Lydia would latch onto those sounds, the scrape of iron, the pop of cedar, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who was simply existing, demanding nothing. Slowly, her heart would unclench. She would lie back down, pulling the quilt tight, knowing that the man downstairs was awake, and that he was standing between her and the dark. By December, the cabin had developed a routine that felt less like servitude and more like a partnership forged in iron. The days were short, the sun a pale coin that rolled briefly along the southern peaks before dipping below the jagged horizon. Caleb began to take her on the trap line. It was not a request. It was a necessity. If he broke a leg or fell through the ice, someone had to know where the line ran, or they would both starve. He fashioned her a pair of snowshoes from ash wood and rawhide, showing her how to walk with a rolling gait to keep the tips from catching. They moved through the timber in silence, the snow muffling their passage. He taught her to read the story written in the white powder. "Rabbit," he said, pointing to a frantic, scattered set of prints near a hemlock. Moving fast, something was behind it. He traced a larger, padded print that followed the rabbit's trail. "Lynx, see the toe spread. He is light, stays on top of the crust." Lydia studied the snow, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She felt a strange satisfaction in deciphering the language of the mountain. It was honest. The mountain did not lie. It did not smile at you while planning your destruction. If a wolf walked here, it left a wolf's mark. One evening, after they had returned with 3 marten pelts and a heavy beaver, Caleb sat at the table with his ledger. It was a battered book with a leather cover, filled with scratching marks that looked more like chicken track than numbers. He was frowning, counting on his fingers, a piece of charcoal hovering over the page. Lydia watched him from the stove where she was stirring a stew of dried venison and root vegetables. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer. "You have missed the 2 skins from Tuesday," she said softly. Caleb looked up, his brow furrowed. "What?" "The tally," she said, pointing to the page. "You have 17 marten listed, but we brought in 2 on Tuesday and 3 today. That makes 22 for the month, if you count the ones curing in the shed." Caleb looked at the book, then at her. "You can do figures." "My father was a schoolteacher," Lydia said, a flicker of the old pride straightening her spine. "I graded the arithmetic papers for the older boys by the time I was 12. I can read, I can write, and I can balance a ledger better than the clerk at the general store." Caleb stared at her. For a moment, she thought he might be offended, his masculine pride wounded by her correction. Instead, he pushed the book toward her. "Do it," he said. Lydia sat down. She took the charcoal. Her handwriting was neat and precise, a sharp contrast to his scrawl. She organized the columns. Date, type of pelt, quality, estimated weight. She tallied the flour, the coffee, the salt pork. She calculated how many weeks of supplies remained if the winter held until April. When she finished, she pushed the book back. Caleb studied it for a long time. He ran a rough thumb over the neat rows of numbers. "We are short on coffee," he murmured, reading her total. "Yes," Lydia said, "but we are rich in furs. If the prices hold—" Caleb looked at her, and the expression in his eyes was one she hadn't seen before. It was respect. "You're handy to have around, Lydia Hart." It was the first time he had complimented her. The warmth of it stayed with her longer than the heat from the stove. A week later, the silence of the mountain was broken by a sound that Caleb Rourke had likely not heard in years. They were in the lean-to, trying to saddle the mule. The animal, a cantankerous beast named Blue, was in a foul mood. The cold had made him stiff, and he had no interest in hauling firewood. Every time Caleb tried to cinch the girth, Blue would inhale deeply, bloating his belly to keep the strap loose. Caleb grunted, shoving his shoulder into the mule's ribs to force the air out. Blue waited until Caleb relaxed, then inflated himself again with a stubborn groan. "You ornery son of a—" Caleb muttered, stepping back and glaring at the animal. Blue looked at him with half-closed eyes and let out a long, loud, vibrating sigh that sounded remarkably like a human harumph of dismissal. Lydia, standing by with the bridle, let out a sound. It was sharp and sudden, like a bird taking flight. A laugh. She clamped her hand over her mouth instantly, her eyes widening. She hadn't laughed in months. The sound felt foreign in her throat, illicit. Caleb turned slowly. He looked at the mule, then at Lydia. He didn't scowl. He looked at her as if she had just performed a magic trick. He looked as if he had forgotten that laughter was something that existed in the world. He sounded just like Reverend Higgins," Lydia stammered, her hand still hovering near her mouth. Caleb looked back at the mule. The corners of his eyes crinkled. It wasn't a smile, not fully, but the heaviness that usually cloaked him seemed to lift an inch. "Reverend's got longer ears," Caleb said dryly. Lydia laughed again, and this time she didn't cover her mouth. The sound drifted up into the pines, fragile and defiant against the gray sky. That night, the wind died down, leaving a silence that was profound and heavy. They sat by the fire, the work of the day done. Caleb was whittling a trigger for a trap, the shavings curling onto the hearth. "You asked about the quilt," he said. He didn't look up from the wood. Lydia stopped her mending. "I didn't mean to pry." "Her name was Sarah," Caleb said. His voice was low, vibrating with the gravel of disuse. "She was small, smaller than you, but she could drag a buck deer a mile if she had to." He paused, the knife stilling in his hand. "It was the fever," he continued. "5 years ago, it came through the valley like a brush fire. I was over the pass, checking the high line. Snow came in early, blocked the trail. I was stuck for 2 weeks. He looked into the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. When I got back, the fire was out. She had tried to keep the baby warm. She wrapped him in everything we had. They were both in the bed. Lydia felt a physical ache in her chest, a hollow mirroring of his pain. She looked at the strong hands holding the knife, hands that could snap a pine branch but hadn't been able to save the things he loved. "It wasn't your fault," Lydia whispered. "The snow. You couldn't have known." "I was away," Caleb said, the self-indictment absolute. "A man is supposed to be there. I built this place for them. Now." He looked around the dim cabin. "Now it's just a box to keep the wind out. A tomb," Lydia thought. "He lives in a tomb." She wanted to reach out and touch his arm, to offer the comfort of human contact, but she held back. She knew the weight of guilt. She carried her own, though hers was thrust upon her by liars. She thought of the secret she carried, hidden in the lining of her bodice, sewn flat so it wouldn't rustle, was a folded piece of paper. She had found it in the grass near the church vestry door the morning the donation box had disappeared. It was a note, unsigned, scrawled in haste. "Done. The box is hid in the root cellar. Saturday is the day. It was dated 2 days before the theft was reported. It was proof. Proof that the theft was planned, staged. Proof that someone, the preacher, the sheriff, or perhaps Samuel Clay himself, had orchestrated her ruin with the precision of a stage play. She fingered the fabric over her chest. She wanted to show him. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't just an exile, but a victim of a conspiracy. But fear held her tongue. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she had forged it? Or worse, what if he believed her and went down to town to demand answers? And the law killed him for it. She couldn't bear to be the cause of another death in this house. So she kept the paper hidden against her heart, a burning secret that kept her warm with rage. January brought a cold that terrified the timber. The mercury in the thermometer outside the door vanished into the bulb. The logs of the cabin popped and groaned, shrinking in the dry freeze. One night, the cold was a physical presence in the room, a beast that had breached the walls. The fire had burned low while they ate, and the chill was immediate. Lydia knelt by the hearth, trying to strike a match to light the kindling. Her fingers were clumsy, numb to the bone. She struck the match against the stone, but her hands shook, and the head snapped off. She tried again. The match flared and went out before it caught the tinder. "Damn," she whispered, a curse she never would have used in Pine Hollow. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She couldn't feel her fingertips. "Lydia," she looked up. Caleb was standing over her. He didn't move her aside. He knelt down, his large frame blocking the draft from the door. "Give me your hands," he said. She hesitated, then held them out. They were red and raw, shaking violently. Caleb took her hands in his. His palms were rough, calloused like leather, but they were incredibly warm. He didn't squeeze. He simply enclosed her freezing fingers in his heat, chafing them gently. He looked at her. His face was inches away. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the gray in his beard, the small scar on his cheekbone. The air in the cabin shifted. It wasn't just the cold anymore. It was a sudden, electric tension that made Lydia's breath hitch. He was looking at her mouth. Lydia felt a wave of panic, the old reflex to pull away, to hide. But beneath the panic was something else, a hunger, a desperate, starving need for warmth that wasn't just about temperature. She had been touched with violence, and she had been touched with dismissal. She had never been touched with reverence. She didn't pull away. She leaned forward, just an inch. Caleb's eyes searched hers, asking a silent question. "Is this all right?" She nodded, a microscopic movement. He closed the distance. His lips were dry, but the kiss was soft. It wasn't the demanding, wet assault she had experienced in the alley. It was hesitant, trembling. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke. It was a question, not a taking. For a moment, Lydia melted into it. She pressed closer to him, her hands still trapped in his, feeling the solid wall of his chest. It was a relief so profound it felt like breaking the surface of deep water after drowning. Then, the memory crashed in. The feel of a man's weight, the smell of whiskey, the accusation of the town, temptress, whore, unwanted. Lydia gasped and shoved herself back, scrambling across the floorboards until her back hit the leg of the table. "I can't," she choked out. "I can't. They were right. I am ruined." Caleb stayed kneeling by the fire. He didn't lunge. He didn't look angry. He looked sad. "You aren't ruined, Lydia," he said steadily. "I let you," she cried, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, shame burning her face. "I wanted it. That makes me what they said I was." "It makes you human," Caleb said. He stood up slowly. "Desire isn't a sin. And what that boy did to you, that wasn't desire. That was power. There is a difference." He walked over to the water bucket, turning his back to give her privacy to compose herself. "No one decides your worth but you," he said to the wall. "Not the preacher, not the town, and not me. If you don't want to be touched, you say so." But don't let them possess your mind after they've already taken your home. Lydia sat on the floor, the tears finally coming. They weren't pretty. They were ugly, heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. She cried for her father. She cried for the lost donation box. She cried for the $100 she would never earn. She cried because for the first time in months, she was in a room with a man and she was safe. Caleb let her cry. When the fire began to die down again, he quietly added a log, and then went to his bed, turning his face to the wall, leaving her the space to rebuild herself. The thaw was still months away, but the world outside was not empty. 2 days after the storm broke, Caleb returned from the creek with a dark look on his face. He didn't hang his coat. He went straight to the rifle rack and checked the load in his sharps. "What is it?" Lydia asked, sensing the shift in him. "Tracks," he said. "Down by the lower crossing." "Wolf?" "Boot," he said. "Hobnailed. Not a trapper's boot. A flat lander." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. The sheriff? Maybe. Or someone looking for game. But they were stopping, looking. Whoever it was stood by the creek and looked up toward the smoke. The safety of the cabin suddenly felt fragile. The walls were thick, but they were wood, not iron. "If they come," Lydia started, her voice trembling. "If they come, they don't get in," Caleb said. His voice was flat, devoid of doubt. "But we need to be careful. No more going out alone." Fear, which had been a low hum, cranked up to a scream. Lydia recognized the pattern. When a town wants you gone, they send you away. When they want you silent, they follow you. The setback came 3 days later. They were checking the snares along the ridge. The snow had crusted over with a layer of ice. Slick as glass. Lydia, walking behind Caleb, stepped on a patch of concealed shale. Her foot slid out, her ankle twisted with a sickening pop, and she went down hard, sliding 10 feet down the slope before grabbing a sapling. The pain was white-hot, blinding. She gasped, clutching her leg. Caleb was beside her in seconds. "Broken?" "I don't think so," she gritted out. "Twisted. Bad." She tried to stand, but the moment she put weight on it, her leg buckled. She cried out, the sound echoing in the ravine. "I can't walk," she whispered, panic rising. Helplessness was a trigger. To be unable to run was to be a victim. Caleb didn't hesitate. He slung his rifle over his back. "Put your arms around my neck." "I can crawl," she argued, tears of humiliation in her eyes. "I am too heavy." "You aren't heavy," he said. He bent down and scooped her up as if she were a child. He carried her for 2 miles. Lydia held on, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. She could feel the strain in his muscles, the heavy thud of his heart against her ribs. He didn't complain. He didn't stumble. He moved with a terrifying, protective strength. Every step he took was a defiance of the men who had hurt her. Those men had used their strength to pin her down. Caleb used his to lift her up. When they got back to the cabin, he set her on the bed. He cut the laces of her boot with his knife, his touch gentle as he peeled back the wool stocking. The ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, blue and angry. He packed it with snow wrapped in a cloth. He made her tea. He moved the table closer to the bed so she could reach her sewing. "I am useless," she muttered, hitting the mattress with her fist. "You are healing," Caleb corrected. "There is a difference." Lydia Hart did not handle confinement well. For a week, she sat with her leg elevated, watching Caleb do her chores. The guilt ate at her, but as the swelling went down, a new resolve hardened in her. She realized that her fear came from her lack of agency. She was afraid of the men in the boots because she had no way to stop them. "Teach me," she said one morning while Caleb was cleaning his rifle. He looked up. "Teach you what?" "To shoot," she said. "Not a rabbit. To shoot a man." Caleb went still. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the shadow of the girl who had arrived in November, and the woman who was forging herself in January. "It kicks like a mule," he warned. "I have handled the mule," she replied. When she could hobble, He took her out behind the cabin. He gave her the spare rifle, a Winchester lever action that was lighter than his sharps but still heavy in her hands. He showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulders so it wouldn't break her collarbone. He showed her how to breathe. In, out, pause, squeeze. "Don't pull it," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Squeeze it, like you're squeezing water from a cloth." Lydia aimed at a pine cone on a stump 50 yards away. Her arms shook. The rifle felt like a living thing, full of death. She fired. The recoil slammed into her, bruising her shoulder. The shot went wide, taking a chunk out of a tree 5 feet to the left. "Again," Caleb said. She fired until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. On the third day, she hit the pine cone. It exploded into wooden shrapnel. Caleb lowered his own rifle. He watched her work the lever, ejecting the spent casing with a fluid, practiced motion. He felt a complicated knot in his chest. It was pride, fierce and bright, but wrapped around it was a cold dread. She was learning to kill because she had to. The innocence he had seen in her eyes that first night was gone, replaced by the flat, assessing gaze of a survivor. He had wanted to protect her from the world, but the world had found her anyway. February brought a false spring, the sun melting the crust just enough to make travel possible. Lydia was outside, hanging wash on a line strung between 2 trees, testing her weight on her healed ankle. She looked up at the ridgeline, a habit she had developed. There was a silhouette against the sky. A rider. He wasn't moving. He was sitting on a large bay horse, watching the cabin. The distance was too great to make out a face, but the shape of the hat was distinct. It wasn't the shapeless fur cap of a trapper. It was a wide-brimmed Stetson, a town hat. Lydia dropped the wet shirt into the snow. She turned and limped as fast as she could to the door. "Caleb!" He was there in an instant, rifle in hand, stepping past her onto the porch. He saw the rider. The rider saw him. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, the rider turned his horse slowly and disappeared back behind the ridge. He hadn't come to visit. He had come to confirm. Caleb lowered the rifle, his jaw working. "He knows we're here." Lydia's hand went to her bodice. She couldn't keep it hidden anymore. If the town was coming, Caleb had to know why. "It's not just the debt," she said, her voice trembling but loud. Caleb turned to her. Lydia reached into her dress and pulled out the folded, sweat-stained paper. She held it out to him. "I found this," she said, "near the church, before they took me." Caleb took the note. He unfolded it. He read the scrawled words. "Done. The box is hid. Saturday is the day." His face darkened, a thunderstorm rolling in. He looked from the paper to Lydia. "You've had this the whole time?" "I was afraid," she admitted. "I didn't know if you would believe me. I didn't want to bring their trouble on you." Caleb crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles white. "Trouble is already here. Lydia." He looked back up at the ridge where the rider had been. The isolation of the winter was over. The sanctuary was breached. "They framed you," Caleb said, the realization settling like a stone. "And now they're checking to see if you're still alive to tell about it." "What do we do?" Lydia asked. She stepped closer to him, not out of weakness, but out of solidarity. She checked the position of the Winchester leaning against the doorframe. Caleb looked at her. He saw the fear. Yes, but he also saw the woman who had learned to tally furs, who had laughed at a mule, who had healed a broken ankle, and who had learned to put a bullet through a pine cone at 50 yards. "We don't hide anymore," Caleb said. He turned back to the cabin, his stride long and purposeful. "Pack the saddlebags," he ordered. "We aren't just surviving the winter, Lydia. We're going to make them answer for it." Lydia looked at the paper in his hand, then at the rifle, and finally at the man who had chosen her over solitude. She nodded, and for the first time in her life, the anger in her heart outweighed the fear. She followed him inside. March arrived not with the gentle greening of the lower valleys, but with the violence of a breaking fever. The silence that had protected Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hart for 4 months was shattered by the sound of water. Every ravine and gully became a throat for the melting snow. The creek, once a frozen ribbon of white, roared into a brown, muscular torrent that chewed at the banks. The ground turned to soup, a slurry of mud and pine needles that sucked at boots and hooves. The isolation of the high country, which had felt like a sanctuary, began to dissolve. The passes were opening. The world was coming up the mountain. Lydia stood on the porch, watching the mist rise off the melting drifts. She held the Winchester rifle in the crook of her arm, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. Her ankle was strong again, though it ached when the barometer dropped. She wore a pair of Caleb's old trousers, cut down and belted with a strip of rawhide, her skirts abandoned for the practicality of survival. She saw them before she heard them. 3 riders emerged from the tree line at the bottom of the meadow. They moved slowly, their horses chest-deep in the scrub brush, picking their way through the mud. Lydia did not panic. The panic had burned out of her months ago, leaving behind a cold, hard vigilance. She stepped back inside the doorway and racked the lever of the rifle. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was level. Caleb was at the table, oiling a trap spring. He didn't look up, but his hands stopped moving. "How many?" "3, 2 deputies. 1 I don't know." Caleb stood up. He picked up the sharps from its peg by the door. He didn't rush. He moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a bear disturbed in its den. He stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself in front of Lydia, but leaving her a line of sight. The riders approached the cabin, their horses blowing hard from the climb. The lead man was Deputy Hatcher, a man with a face like a clenched fist and a tin star pinned to a coat that cost more than a deputy's salary. Beside him was Deputy Graves, younger, with nervous eyes. The third man was a stranger, a hired hand with a long gun across his saddle and a hat pulled low. They stopped 10 yards from the porch. Hatcher smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze flicked over Caleb, assessing the size of him, then settled on Lydia with a look of possessive familiarity that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Rourke," Hatcher called out. "Thaws early this year?" "State your business," Caleb said. He held the rifle across his chest, his finger resting on the trigger guard. "Just doing our civic duty," Hatcher said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "Council sent us up to check on the girl. Make sure she is earning her keep. Make sure she is safe." "She is safe," Caleb said. "You can go." Hatcher laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Now, Caleb, that ain't for you to decide. Miss Hart is a ward of the town until her debt is satisfied. We have paperwork." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded document. He waved it in the air like a flag. "The Reverend wants to ensure the terms of the contract are being met," Hatcher continued. "And there have been rumors. People talking about a mountain man keeping a decent woman up here against her will. We are here to bring her back to Pine Hollow, to answer some questions." Lydia stepped out from behind Caleb's shoulder. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. "I'm not being held against my will," Lydia said. Her voice felt thin in the open air, but the words were clear. "And I have no desire to return to Pine Hollow." Hatcher's smile vanished. He looked at her trousers, her wind-burned cheeks, and the rifle in her hands. His expression curdled into disgust. "You don't have a choice, darling," Hatcher sneered. "You are property of the debt. You belong to the town council until that money is paid. Now, put down that gun and get your things, or we will drag you down." "She is a free woman," Caleb said. His voice dropped an octave, rumbling deep in his chest. "And she said no." The hired hand shifted his grip on his rifle. Caleb's eyes snapped to him, promising instant violence if the barrel rose another inch. The man froze. "She is a thief and a whore," Hatcher spat, his polite mask slipping entirely. "And you are harboring a fugitive. Now step aside, Rourke, or we will add your name to the warrant." Hatcher kicked his horse forward, ignoring the threat of the sharps. He rode right up to the porch steps. He reached out, his gloved hand snatching at Lydia's arm. "Come on, girl," he growled. "Let's go." Lydia flinched. It was a reflex. faster than thought. Her breath caught, her throat closing as the leather glove clamped around her bicep. For a second, she was back in the alley, helpless, overpowered. She froze, the rifle barrel dipping toward the floorboards. Then the world exploded into motion. Caleb dropped the sharps and moved with a speed that defied his size. His left hand shot out and clamped over Hatcher's wrist, pinning it against the rough wood of the door frame. There was a sickening crunch of bone grinding against wood. Hatcher screamed. Caleb leaned in, his face inches from the deputies. His eyes were black voids. "Don't touch her!" The words were not a shout. They were a death sentence spoken in a whisper. Hatcher tried to pull back, his face draining of color, but Caleb's grip was iron. The hired hand raised his rifle, but Lydia snapped her Winchester up. The barrel leveled at his chest. Her hands were shaking, but her finger was tight on the trigger. "Back off!" she yelled. "Back off, or I swear I will shoot!" The hired hand hesitated. He looked at the wild desperation in Lydia's eyes and the lethal calm in Caleb's. And he lowered his weapon. Caleb shoved Hatcher backward. The deputy nearly fell from his saddle, clutching his wrist, wheezing with pain. "Get off my land," Caleb said. "If I see you again, I won't aim for the wrist." Hatcher scrambled to regain his seat, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. "You are dead. Rourke, you hear me? We will be back with the sheriff and a posse of 20 men. You are dead!" He spurred his horse, wheeling it around in the mud. The 3 men galloped back toward the tree line, disappearing into the timber. Silence rushed back into the clearing, but it was brittle now. Lydia lowered the rifle. Her legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, the adrenaline crashing out of her system. She began to shake, violent, uncontrollable tremors that rattled her teeth. She was furious. She was furious that after months of healing, after learning to shoot and track and survive, one man's touch could still turn her into a frightened child. "I froze," she whispered, her hands gripping her knees. "He touched me, and I froze." Caleb stood over her. He didn't speak immediately. He watched the tree line for a long minute, ensuring they were truly gone. Then he leaned the sharps against the wall and sat down on the step beside her. He didn't touch her. He waited. He let her breathe. "You raised the rifle," Caleb said quietly. "You stopped the other man. I let him grab me. You are alive," Caleb said. "That is the only score that counts." Lydia turned to him. Tears of rage were streaming down her face. "I hate them. I hate that they think they can just come here and take me. I hate that I am still afraid." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Hold me, please, just hold me so I stop shaking." Caleb nodded. He opened his arms, and she collapsed into them. He held her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was a fortress. He held her with a fierce, protective pressure, trying to transfer his own steadiness into her trembling frame. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun glint off the mud. "We can't stay here," Caleb said finally. "They will be back. Hatcher won't let this go." Lydia pulled back, wiping her face. "Where do we go?" "North," Caleb said. "Deep into the Wind River Range, or Canada. I know places where the law doesn't go, cabins where no one would ever find us. We could disappear. Lydia, live out our lives where they can't reach us." Lydia looked at the mountains rising in the distance. To disappear, to never see a sneering face again, to live in peace, it was a tempting dream. But then she thought of the note hidden in her bodice. She thought of the smiles of the women in town who had looked away when she was accused. She thought of Hatcher's laugh. If she ran, she was admitting guilt. If she ran, she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. A fugitive, a thief, a whore in the eyes of the world. "No," Lydia said. Caleb looked at her, surprised. "Lydia, if we stay—" "I don't want to run," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I am tired of running. I am tired of hiding. I did nothing wrong. Caleb, they stole from me. They stole my name. If we go to Canada, they keep it forever. They will kill us if we go back to Pine Hollow. Caleb warned. I don't want to go to Pine Hollow, Lydia said. Not yet. I want to go to the circuit judge. I want to go to someone who isn't owned by Reverend Higgins. Caleb studied her face. He saw the steel in her jaw, the fire that had replaced the fear. That means going down, he said. Toward civilization, toward people. We go to Miller's Crossing, Lydia said. The trading post. Mr. Miller is honest. He might know where the circuit judge is riding this spring. Caleb sighed, a heavy sound of resignation and admiration. He stood up and offered her a hand. Pack the mule, he said. We leave within the hour. The journey to Miller's Crossing took 4 days of hard travel. They avoided the main trails, sticking to the deer paths and rocky ridges where tracks were harder to spot. The land was waking up around them. Wildflowers pushed through the melting snow, purple pasque-flowers and yellow buttercups. The air smelled of pine resin and wet earth. They made camp in the hollows, lighting small fires that produced little smoke. The shared danger stripped away the last barriers of their reserve. On the second night, they lay under the stars, sharing the wedding ring quilt. The air was cold, biting at their noses, but under the wool, their body heat created a cocoon. Lydia lay on her back, looking at the sweep of the Milky Way. Do you think I am bad? She asked into the darkness. Caleb shifted beside her. Bad? For wanting this, she said softly. For wanting to be close to you. The Reverend. He said women who feel things like that are flawed, that we are vessels for sin. Caleb turned on his side, propping himself up on one elbow. He looked down at her, his face shadowed. The Reverend is a man who thinks God is a ledger book, Caleb said. He thinks everything is a debt or a payment, but desire isn't a sin. Lydia, it is just life. It is the blood moving in your veins. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from her forehead. His fingers were rough, but his touch was feather-light. You aren't flawed, he said. You are the strongest thing I have ever seen. And wanting warmth, wanting to be held, that doesn't take away your dignity. It just proves you aren't made of stone. Lydia closed her eyes, leaning into his hand. I was so afraid, she whispered. Afraid that if I let myself want you, I would become what they said I was. You are Lydia Hart, Caleb said, and you define what that means. The next evening, they reached a high meadow just a few miles from the trading post. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. They turned the horses loose to graze on the new grass. Lydia walked to the edge of the clearing. The wind was gentle here, carrying the scent of sagebrush. Caleb followed her, stopping a few feet away. She turned to face him. He looked tired, his eyes lined with the strain of watching the horizon. But when he looked at her, the exhaustion seemed to fade. Lydia stepped forward. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the heavy wool of his coat and the solid beat of his heart beneath it. She looked up at him, her eyes clear. She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her mouth to his. Caleb went still. He didn't pull away, but he didn't immediately respond. He held himself in check, a massive reservoir of restraint. Lydia, he murmured against her lips. Are you sure? He was giving her an out. He was asking for permission, not just for the kiss, but for everything it implied. He was handing her the power. Yes, she whispered. I am sure. I am choosing this, with a groan that sounded like something breaking. Caleb wrapped his arms around her. He kissed her back, and this time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of hunger, of months of silence and sidelong glances finally given voice. It was rough and real and desperate. Lydia's hands tangled in his hair. She pressed herself against him, reclaiming her body. For the first time since the alley, her skin didn't feel like a target. It felt like her own. She wasn't being taken. She was giving, and she was taking back. Miller's Crossing was a single-log building that served as a store, post office, and way station. Amos Miller and his wife, Martha, were gray-haired, sturdy folk who had survived 20 years on the frontier by minding their own business and treating everyone fair. They looked surprised when Caleb walked in, filling the doorway, with Lydia limping slightly behind him. "Caleb Rourke," Amos said, putting down a sack of coffee beans. "Haven't seen you since autumn. And Miss Hart?" Lydia stepped forward. "Hello, Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller." Martha Miller wiped her hands on her apron and came around the counter. She looked at Lydia's trousers, her weathered face, and the pistol tucked into her belt. She didn't judge. She just nodded. "You look like you've walked a long road, child," Martha said. "Coffee is hot." Over 10 cups of steaming coffee, the truth began to spill out. Lydia told them everything: the false accusation, the staged theft, the winter in the cabin. Amos listened, his face grim. He chewed on a piece of straw. "I believe you," Amos said finally. "Never did sit right with me. That story about the donation box. Higgins has been spending money like water lately. Bought the creek land south of town. Paid cash." "The creek land?" Caleb asked. "That is worthless scrub." "Not if the railroad spur comes through," Amos said. "Rumor is the surveyor was here last summer. Higgins and Sheriff Barron have been buying up the right-of-way quietly." Lydia's eyes widened. "The note," she whispered. "The theft. It wasn't about morality. It was about money. They needed the donation funds to cover a land payment. And they needed a scapegoat to explain where the money went." Caleb finished, his voice cold. "It gets worse," Amos warned. "Sheriff Barron was here 2 days ago. Posting bills." He walked to the wall and pulled down a piece of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a wanted poster, cruder than the official ones, printed on a local press. Wanted for grand larceny and fleeing justice. Lydia Hart, wanted for aiding and abetting. Caleb Rourke, reward, $50. "They upped the stakes," Caleb said, staring at his own name. "They aren't trying to bring you back anymore. Lydia, they're trying to hunt us down." "Barron has a posse out," Amos said. "Deputies and some hired guns. They're combing the foothills. If I were you, I'd keep moving." They left at dawn, loaded with supplies Amos had given them on credit. "Pay me when you clear your names," the old man had said. Handing Caleb a box of ammunition, they headed east, toward Laramie, where the circuit judge was rumored to be holding court. But the net was tighter than they realized. By midday, they were navigating a narrow ridge trail that dropped off steeply into a rocky canyon. The wind was high, masking sound. Lydia was riding Blue the mule, while Caleb walked ahead, leading his horse. The trail twisted around a massive outcropping of granite. The first shot cracked through the air like a whip. Rock splinters exploded inches from Caleb's face, stinging his cheek. "Down!" Caleb roared. He slapped the rump of Lydia's mule, sending it scrambling back around the bend. He dove behind a fallen log just as a second bullet whined past his ear. "It's them!" Lydia screamed, sliding off the mule and grabbing her Winchester from the scabbard. She pressed herself against the granite wall. 3 men were positioned on the opposing ridge, 200 yards away. Puffs of white smoke marked their positions. "Pin them down," a voice shouted across the canyon. It was Hatcher. Caleb raised the sharps. He didn't fire rapidly. He took a breath, aimed, and squeezed. The heavy boom of the buffalo gun rolled like thunder. On the far ridge, rock exploded in front of one of the gunmen, spraying him with stone shrapnel. The man yelled and ducked. "Lydia!" Caleb shouted over the wind. "We can't stay here. They have the high ground." "Where do we go?" she yelled back. "The creek bottom, into the timber. That's a sheer drop." "It's that or a bullet. Move!" They abandoned the animals. There was no way to get the horses down the scree slope. Caleb grabbed his saddlebags and the ammunition. Lydia shouldered her rifle. They slid down the slope, a controlled fall of sliding shale and dust. Bullets kicked up dirt around them. One struck the heel of Lydia's boot, jerking her leg, but didn't penetrate. They hit the tree line breathless and bruised. "Keep moving," Caleb ordered. "Cross the water. We have to lose the tracks." They plunged into the freezing creek. The water was waist deep, numbing instantly. The current tried to sweep them away. Caleb grabbed Lydia's belt, anchoring her against the flow. They scrambled up the far bank, shivering and soaked, and vanished into the dense spruce forest. They ran for an hour, doubling back, walking on rocks to hide their prints, using every trick Caleb knew. Finally, as dusk fell, they found an abandoned line shack, a three-walled ruin used by cowboys in the summer. It smelled of rat droppings and old hay, but it was dry. They collapsed against the wall, lungs burning. Caleb checked the load in his rifle, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. Lydia sat with her head between her knees, gasping for air. Her wet clothes clung to her, freezing in the night air. "We lost the horses," she said, her voice hollow. "We kept our lives," Caleb said. He looked at her. Her face was scratched from a branch, bleeding a little. She looked wild, ferocious, and exhausted. "They aren't going to stop," Lydia said. She lifted her head. "They are going to kill us. They tried to kill us." "Yes," Caleb said. "They are scared. Men who are scared do terrible things." He moved closer to her, shivering himself. "We need to get warm, or the hypothermia will finish what the bullets started." They stripped off their wet outer layers and huddled together in the corner, sharing body heat under the one dry blanket Caleb had managed to grab. Caleb looked at the woman in his arms. He had lost a wife to the cold. The terror of history repeating itself was a cold knot in his stomach. "I am afraid," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Lydia looked up at him. "You? Afraid?" "I'm not afraid of dying," Caleb said. "I'm afraid of losing you. I'm afraid of failing you the way I failed Sarah." Lydia reached up and cupped his face. Her hand was cold, but her touch was steady. "You haven't failed me," she said fiercely. "You saved me. Every day. You save me." She looked out into the darkening forest, where men with badges and guns were hunting them like animals. "I am done running, Caleb," she said. "We go to Laramie. We find that judge, and we burn them down. Not with bullets, with the truth." "It will be dangerous," Caleb said. "Entering town, it will be walking into a trap." "Then we spring the trap," Lydia said. "I will face Pine Hollow. I will stand in front of them, even if my knees shake, but I will not let them win." Caleb pulled her closer, burying his face in her damp hair. "Then we go together." "Together," she promised. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. But inside the ruined shack, two outcasts made a pact that was stronger than stone. They would not let shame or prejudice decide their future. They would fight. Pine Hollow had not changed in the months Lydia Hart had been away, yet it looked entirely different. Before, it had been her home, a place of muddy familiarity and small comforts. Now, as she rode down the main thoroughfare beside Caleb Rourke, the town looked like the jaw of a steel trap waiting to snap shut. The snow here had turned to a thick, churning slush that coated the boardwalks in brown filth. The buildings, with their false fronts and painted signs, seemed to lean inward, casting long, judgmental shadows across the street. They rode in silence. Caleb sat on a borrowed bay horse, his back a wall of tension, the buffalo coat making him look twice the size of any man on the street. Lydia rode the mule. Blue, her back straight, her chin lifted high. She wore the trousers she had cut down in the mountains, but she had scrubbed her face and braided her hair with severe precision. She would not give them the satisfaction of looking wild. The silence of the street was louder than a shout. As they passed the general store, a woman Lydia had known since childhood, Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, stopped sweeping her porch. She looked at Lydia, her eyes widening, and then she turned her back with a sharp, deliberate swish of her skirts, going inside and slamming the door. A group of men standing outside the saloon stopped their conversation. They did not turn away. They stared. One of them, a ranch hand with a scarred lip, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud near the mule's hooves. "Look at that," the man said, his voice carrying easily in the damp air. "Mountain man brought his pet back down." Caleb's hand twitched toward the rifle scabbard, but he did not turn his head. "Keep riding," Caleb said. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. "Don't look at them." "I'm not afraid of them," Lydia said, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Good," Caleb said, "because fear makes a man bold, but don't give them an excuse, not yet." Above them, the bell in the church tower began to toll. It was a hollow, iron sound that rang out the hour, but to Lydia, it sounded like a warning. Clang, clang. "Go away. Clang. You are not welcome here." They made for the trading post on the edge of town, the one neutral ground they had left. Amos Miller was waiting for them, holding the door open. He ushered them inside quickly, as if he expected lightning to strike the threshold. The interior smelled of sawdust, coffee, and tension. Standing by the pot-bellied stove was a thin man in a dusty black suit, clutching a leather satchel, and a stout woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "This is them," Amos said, locking the door behind them. "Lydia, Caleb, this is Silas Thorne. He's the clerk for Judge Galloway, and this is Martha Gable." Lydia stiffened. "Gable? The baker's wife is my sister-in-law," the older woman said, her voice raspy and dry. "And a fool who believes everything the preacher tells her. I am the midwife. I see people when they are born, and I see women when they are broken. I know the difference between a sin and a bruise." Silas Thorne pushed his spectacles up his nose. He looked nervous, glancing at the window. "Mr. Miller says you wish to file a formal complaint against the town council." "That is a dangerous piece of paper to write. Mr. Rourke." "I am filing it," Caleb said, stepping into the light. "Lydia is the witness." "We have evidence," Lydia added. She reached into her coat and pulled out the crumpled note she had carried through the winter. She placed it on the counter. Thorne picked it up with long, ink-stained fingers. He adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the scrawl. "Done. The box is hid in the root cellar. Saturday is the day." "No signature," Thorne muttered. "But the hand, the slant of the T-E and the heavy loop on the Y." He looked up, his face pale. "This looks like Deacon Weaver's hand. He keeps the ledger for the Reverend." "The deacon," Lydia said, the realization settling like a stone. "He was the one who claimed he saw me leaving the church." "If Weaver wrote this," Thorne said, "then the theft was premeditated. And if the Reverend approved it, then this is not just theft. It is conspiracy and fraud." "Can you get it to the judge?" Caleb asked. "Judge Galloway is riding the circuit," Thorne said. "He is due in Laramie in 3 days, but he usually stops at the relay station north of here first. I can get a message to him. I can request a special hearing. But you have to understand, once I send that telegram, there is no going back. The sheriff will know." "He already knows," Caleb said grimly. "Send it." The next 2 days were a study in suffocation. They could not stay at the trading post. Amos had too much to lose. Instead, they rented a small room above the livery stable, paid for with a beaver pelt Caleb had saved. It was a single room with a sloped ceiling and a window that looked out over the back alleys of Pine Hollow. Venturing out was a gauntlet. Lydia needed to buy thread to mend her coat. She walked down the boardwalk, her head high. She passed 2 women she had taught Sunday school with. They saw her coming and crossed the muddy street, lifting their hems as if Lydia were a puddle of sewage. "Shameless," one whispered loud enough to be heard. "Living with a wild animal," the other hissed. "No better than a savage herself." Lydia stopped. She turned to face them. The women froze, looking shocked that the object of their scorn would dare to have eyes. "I can hear you," Lydia said clearly. "And I pray your daughters never face what I have faced." The women stared, their mouths hanging open. Before hurrying away, Lydia felt a trembling in her hands, but she clenched them into fists and kept walking. She refused to shrink. She refused to disappear. Caleb fared no better. He went to the saloon, not to drink, but to listen. The moment he pushed through the swinging doors, the room went quiet. Sheriff Barron was sitting at a poker table near the back. He stood up slowly, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. "You have a lot of nerve walking in here." "Rourke," the sheriff said. There is still a question of a warrant. The clerk says the warrant is suspended pending a hearing, Caleb said, his voice flat. Unless you want to explain to Judge Galloway why you arrested a man without cause. Barron laughed. A cold, humorless sound. He stepped closer, invading Caleb's space. He smelled of whiskey and hair oil. Laws are flexible out here. Mountain man, Barron said. Accidents happen. Guns go off. Men get into fights. He shoved Caleb's shoulder. It was a hard, provoking shove, meant to trigger a swing. If Caleb threw a punch, Barron could shoot him in self-defense. Caleb rocked back on his heels but did not raise his hands. He looked at the sheriff with a boredom that was more insulting than a curse. I don't fight boys with badges, Caleb said. I'll save it for the judge. He turned and walked out, his back a massive target. The silence in the saloon held until the doors swung shut behind him. That evening, Lydia went to see Martha Gable. The midwife lived in a small cottage behind the apothecary. The house smelled of dried sage and strong soap. Martha poured tea into chipped cups. She looked at Lydia's face, tracing the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. You aren't sleeping, Martha observed. I dream of the hearing, Lydia admitted. I dream that I open my mouth to speak, and no sound comes out. That is what they want, Martha said. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. You are not the first. Lydia, you know that, don't you? Lydia's cup clattered against the saucer. What? The Reverend's son, Martha said. Samuel. And the deacon. They have appetites. And the Reverend has a need for money to cover his investments. You are not the first girl to be branded unwanted. Who? Lydia whispered. Sarah Miller, the Smith's daughter. 2 years ago, they said she ran off with a drummer. She didn't. She was sent to a brothel in Cheyenne to work off a debt her father supposedly owed. And young Elspeth, the washerwoman's girl. She saw something she shouldn't have. They threatened her mother's livelihood until the girl went mute. Lydia felt a cold horror seep into her bones. I thought it was just me. I thought I was the only one. That is how they win, Martha said fiercely. They make you feel alone. They make you feel like the sin is yours. I treated Elspeth's bruises after Samuel cornered her. I know the shape of his fingers. Lydia looked down at her own wrist, remembering the mark Caleb had seen in the wash basin. I have to speak, Lydia said. For them. If you speak, Martha warned. They will try to destroy you, truly destroy you. They are already saying you are Caleb's whore. They will say worse. Let them say it, Lydia said. I know who I am. The strain, however, was taking its toll in the small room above the livery. The air in the room was thick with unspoken fear. Caleb paced the small floor, 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. He checked the window constantly. We should have gone to Canada, he said abruptly, turning from the glass. Lydia looked up from the table where she was writing down everything she remembered for the clerk. We decided, Caleb. I decided to keep you safe, he snapped. The anger wasn't at her. It was at his own helplessness. Look at this place. Lydia, they hate you. They look at you like you are dirt. I dragged you back into the fire. You didn't drag me, Lydia said, standing up. I walked. I chose this. And if they hang us? Caleb asked, his voice rising. If Barron decides to put a bullet in me tonight and drag you off to a cell? What then? Then we die fighting, Lydia said. Is that worse than hiding in a hole for the rest of our lives? Yes, Caleb roared. He slammed his hand against the wall, shaking the dust from the rafters. Yes, it is worse. Because you would be dead. I can't lose you. Lydia, I can't put you in the ground. The silence that followed was heavy. Lydia walked over to him. He was breathing hard, his forehead pressed against the rough wood of the wall. She reached out and touched his back. He flinched, then leaned into her touch. You aren't going to lose me, she said softly. But you are losing yourself if you think running is the answer. She turned him around. His eyes were tormented. I want to go, he whispered. I want to take you to the high country, where no one can say your name with spit in their mouth. I know, Lydia said, but I need to be here. And I need you to be here with me. Not as a guard, As the man I choose. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them. The room was cold, but the heat radiating from him was intense. I want you, Caleb, she said. The confession hung in the air, bold and terrifying. Not because I am scared, not because I need protection. I want to be chosen, and I want to choose. I want to feel safe enough to desire something without panic. Caleb looked at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation. I have wanted you since the first night, he admitted, his voice rough. Since I saw you try to mend my shirt with shaking hands. But I promised myself I would never take anything you didn't give freely. I am giving it, Lydia said. She reached up and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion. Caleb's restraint broke. He didn't grab her. He enveloped her. He pulled her against him, his mouth finding hers with a desperation that tasted of months of solitude. They moved to the narrow bed. It was slow, a deliberate dismantling of barriers. Every touch was a question, and every response was an answer. When he touched the scar on her shoulder, he kissed it. When she flinched, just once, a reflex of old memory, he stopped instantly, hovering over her, waiting until she pulled him back down. There was no shame in the dark room. There was only the sound of breath, the warmth of skin, and the profound, healing realization that they belonged to themselves and to each other. The peace did not last. Sunday morning brought the town's retaliation. Lydia and Caleb did not go to the church, but the church came to them. The windows of the livery room were open to catch the breeze. The Reverend's voice, amplified by practiced theatrics, drifted from the open doors of the chapel down the street. And let us not be deceived by the wolves who come in sheep's clothing, the Reverend bellowed, or the harlots who claim innocence while lying in the bed of savages. We have a cancer in our midst, brothers and sisters, a woman who stole from God and now returns to flaunt her sin. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale. She gripped Caleb's hand until her knuckles were white. He is talking about me, she whispered. He is talking about a ghost he is afraid of. Caleb said, he is shouting because he knows the truth is coming. That night, the violence moved from words to stone. They were asleep when the glass shattered. A rock, the size of a fist, crashed through the window, spraying shards across the floor. Caleb was up in a heartbeat, pistol in hand, shoving Lydia down to the floorboards. He moved to the window, flattening himself against the wall, peering out into the darkness. Cowards, he yelled into the night. Show your faces. There was only the sound of running footsteps splashing in the mud. Lydia crawled to the rock. It was wrapped in a piece of paper. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. Leave or vanish. They are getting desperate, Caleb said, kicking the glass aside. He nailed a blanket over the window. They know the judge is coming. 2 days before the judge was due, Lydia went to the livery stable to check on the mule. The stable master was a friend of Amos, one of the few who would let them keep animals there. It was late afternoon, the shadows stretching long in the alley. Lydia was brushing Blue's flank, the repetitive motion soothing her nerves. She didn't hear the man approach. She smelled him, stale tobacco and sweat. A rough hand clamped over her mouth. An arm hooked around her waist, lifting her off her feet. Gotcha, you little witch, a voice growled in her ear. It wasn't the sheriff. It was the hired hand from the mountain raid. Lydia didn't freeze, not this time. She dropped the brush and slammed her heel back, driving it into the man's shin. He grunted but didn't let go. He dragged her backward toward the open door of a waiting wagon. Stop fighting, he hissed. You're going for a long ride. Lydia bit down. Hard. She tasted the salt of his skin and the leather of his glove. She bit until her jaw ached. The man howled and loosened his grip on her mouth. Caleb, she screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and piercing. The man punched her. It was a clumsy blow to the side of her head, sending her reeling into the side of the stall. She fell, dazed, stars exploding in her vision. He lunged for her again. Lydia's hand scrambled in the straw. She felt the cold metal of the pistol Caleb had insisted she carry in her belt. She ripped it free. She didn't have time to aim. She swung the heavy barrel in an arc, smashing it into the man's face as he reached for her. Bone cracked. The man staggered back, clutching his nose, blood pouring through his fingers. "I said back off!" Lydia yelled, leveling the gun. Her hand was shaking, but the hammer was cocked. "You crazy bu—" The stable doors burst open. Caleb Rourke didn't just enter. He exploded into the space. He saw Lydia on the ground, the blood on her face, and the man standing over her. A roar tore from Caleb's chest, a sound so primal it made the horses scream in their stalls. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't use a weapon. He hit the man with his shoulder, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the support beam of the barn. Dust rained down from the rafters. The man crumpled, gasping for air. Caleb grabbed him by the throat, lifting him up, his other hand drawing a knife from his belt. "Caleb, no!" The shout came from the doorway. It was Amos Miller, holding a shotgun. Caleb froze, the knife inching toward the man's jugular. His eyes were glazed with a killing rage. "He touched her," Caleb snarled. "If you kill him, you hang," Amos said. "And Lydia stands alone. Let him go." Caleb's chest heaved. He looked at the terrified hired hand, then at Lydia. She was standing now, leaning against the stall, the pistol lowered. She nodded, her eyes wide. Caleb released his grip. The man dropped to the dirt, coughing and retching. "Run," Caleb said. "Tell Barron that if he sends another dog, I will send back a carcass." The man scrambled up and bolted out the back door, leaving a trail of blood in the sawdust. Caleb turned to Lydia. He holstered his knife and went to her, his hands hovering, afraid to touch her bruised face. "I'm all right," she said, wincing as she touched her cheek. "I fought him. I didn't freeze." "You did good," Caleb whispered, pulling her into him. "God, you did good." The next morning, the mood in the room was grim. Silas Thorne came to see them, his face gray. "The sheriff is spinning a story," Thorne warned. "He says Caleb attacked a citizen without provocation. He says Lydia is dangerous. He is trying to get the judge to sign a confinement order the moment he arrives." "When does the judge arrive?" Caleb asked. "Tomorrow, noon. The hearing is set for 1 o'clock in the town hall." "We need witnesses," Lydia said. "My word against the sheriff won't be enough." "The note helps, but they will say I forged it." "Mrs. Gable is willing to speak," Thorne said. "But she is the sister-in-law of the baker. They will say she is biased." "We need Elspeth," Lydia said. Thorne shook his head. "The washerwoman's girl? She hasn't spoken a word in 2 years. She is terrified of her own shadow." "She saw the preacher's son," Lydia said. "She knows." "It's too dangerous," Caleb said. "Lydia, look at your face. They will kill anyone who stands with us. If we don't get her to speak, we are dead anyway," Lydia said. "I'm going to see her." Lydia waited until dusk. She slipped out the back of the livery, wearing a heavy shawl to hide her face. She made her way to the shanties near the creek where the washerwomen lived. She found Elspeth sitting on a crate behind a line of drying sheets. The girl was young, barely 18, with eyes like a trapped deer. Lydia sat down on the dirt beside her. She didn't touch her. She just pulled back her shawl, revealing the fresh bruise on her cheek and the old pistol in her belt. "They hurt me, too," Lydia said softly. Elspeth looked at the bruise, then at Lydia's eyes. "They want us to be quiet," Lydia continued. "They think if they hit us hard enough, we will disappear. But I am not disappearing. Elspeth, I am going to stand in front of the judge tomorrow, and I am going to tell him what Samuel did. I'm going to tell him about the box. I am going to tell him about the cabin." Elspeth's lip trembled. "I need you to stand with me," Lydia said. "Not for me, for yourself. Because if we don't stop them, they will do it to the next girl, and the next." Elspeth opened her mouth. No sound came out. She closed her eyes, tears squeezing out. Then she nodded. A single, sharp jerk of her chin. That night, Back in the room, Caleb sat cleaning his pistol. He did it methodically, over and over. "I looked at that man in the barn," Caleb said quietly. "And I wanted to open his throat. I wanted to watch the light go out of his eyes." He looked up at Lydia. "I have killed men before. Lydia, in the war, on the trail. But this is different. The darkness in me, it's hungry. I am willing to burn this whole town to the ground to keep you safe, and that scares me." Lydia walked over to him. She took the gun from his hands and set it on the table. She took his face in her hands. "You are angry," she said. "You have a right to be, but you are not them. They use violence to take. You use it to protect." She kissed his forehead. "Don't become their kind of man, Caleb," she whispered. "Be mine, still good, still alive. We walk into that hall tomorrow as people, not executioners. If we turn into monsters to fight them, they have already won." Caleb closed his eyes, leaning into her strength. "Yours," he promised. "I am yours." Outside, the wind rattled the board over the window, but inside, they were ready. The sun would rise on Judgment Day. The week before the hearing descended upon Pine Hollow like a suffocating blanket of wet wool. The air in the small room above the livery stable grew stale and heavy, charged with the static of waiting. In the high mountains, danger had been vast and open, a storm on the horizon, a wolf pack on a ridge. Here, danger was compressed into narrow alleys, whispered conversations behind hands, and the feeling of eyes watching from every darkened window. Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hart slept in shifts. When Caleb slept, his pistol lay within an inch of his hand, his breathing shallow and alert. When Lydia slept, she thrashed in the grip of nightmares where the walls of the room shrank until they crushed her. They trusted no footstep on the boardwalk below. Every creak of the stairs sent Caleb to the door, his body blocking the wood. A silent sentinel against the town that wanted to swallow them whole. The landscape of the town felt claustrophobic. The sky was cut into ribbons by roof lines. The mud was churned by too many boots. There was no clean wind to scour away the smell of horse manure and coal smoke. On Tuesday, 3 days before Judge Galloway was due to arrive, the sheriff made his move. It happened at midday. Caleb had gone down to the water trough to wash the grime from his face. Lydia was watching him from the window, her hand resting on the sill. She saw Sheriff Barron approach, flanked by 3 deputies, men who wore their badges like licenses to maim. They did not draw their guns immediately. Barron walked up to Caleb, who was drying his face with a rag. "Caleb Rourke," Barron announced, his voice carrying up to the window. "You are under arrest." Caleb lowered the rag slowly. He did not reach for the knife at his belt. "On what charge, Sheriff?" "Assault with a deadly weapon," Barron said, smiling with his teeth but not his eyes. "That stable hand you threw into a beam has a cracked rib and a clouded memory. He says you attacked him unprovoked. That is disturbing the peace and attempted murder." "He was attacking a woman," Caleb said, his voice level. "That is for a judge to decide." Barron said, "Until then, you wait in a cell. Boys, take him." Lydia gasped, her fingers gripping the window frame until a splinter dug into her palm. She saw Caleb tense, his muscles coiling to fight. He looked up at the window. He saw her face. If he fought, they would shoot him. They were waiting for him to throw a punch so they could put a bullet in his chest and call it justice. Caleb unclenched his fists. He held his hands out. "I will go," Caleb said. "But if anything happens to her while I'm inside, Barron, no jail built by man will keep me from you." Barron laughed, clicking the irons onto Caleb's wrists. "Get him out of here." They dragged him away, leaving Lydia standing at the window, the silence of the room suddenly deafening. The plan was clear. They had stripped her of her protector. They wanted her alone, terrified, and silent before the judge arrived. Lydia did not hide. The old Lydia, the schoolteacher's daughter who sewed in the back room and kept her eyes on the floor, might have bolted the door and wept. The woman who had survived a mountain winter put on her coat, checked the load in her pistol, and walked out the door. She walked straight to the jailhouse. The street was a gauntlet. Men leaned against posts, smirking as she passed. "Where's your bear now, girl?" one called out. "Looks like the mountain whore is lost." Another jeered. Lydia looked straight ahead. Her chin lifted so high her neck ached. She marched up the steps of the jail and pushed open the heavy door. Deputy Hatcher was sitting at the desk, his feet up, whittling a stick. He looked up, his face darkening as he recognized the woman who had held a rifle on him. "I am here to see him," Lydia said. "Prisoners don't get visitors." Hatcher sneered. "The law says a prisoner is allowed counsel and visitation before a hearing," Lydia said, her voice steady. "Unless you want me to add violation of prisoner rights to the list of complaints I am handing Judge Galloway the moment he steps off his coach." Hatcher hesitated. He knew the judge was coming. He knew Galloway had a reputation for hanging lawmen who broke the rules. He spat into a spittoon and tossed a heavy ring of keys on the desk. "5 minutes," he grunted. "Don't pass him nothing." Lydia walked back to the cells. There were 2 iron cages. Caleb was in the far one, sitting on a cot that was little more than a plank. He stood up when he saw her. He came to the bars, his large hands gripping the cold iron. "Lydia," he breathed, "you shouldn't be here. It isn't safe." "I am not leaving you," she said, stepping close until her chest bumped the bars. "They think this will break me. They think if you are gone, I will turn into a ghost and fade away." "Baron wants you scared," Caleb said. His eyes searched her face, hungry for the sight of her. "He wants you to stutter when you speak to the judge." "I won't stutter," Lydia promised. She reached through the bars. She couldn't hug him, so she placed her palms against his cheeks. His beard was rough, his skin warm. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "I'm going to get you out," she whispered. "Just stay alive," Caleb said, opening his eyes. They were dark and fierce. "That is all I care about. The hearing, the town, the reputation. Burn it all. Just stay alive." "We are going to win," Lydia said. "I am not just surviving anymore. Caleb, I am fighting." They stood there for a long moment, separated by iron but connected by a current of shared strength that was more intimate than any touch they had shared in the bed. It was the intimacy of soldiers in a trench. "5 minutes is up," Hatcher yelled from the front room. Lydia pulled her hands back. "I love you," she said. The words came out simple and hard, like stones. Caleb looked at her, and for a moment, the bars seemed to vanish. "I love you," he answered. "Now go! Lock your door!" The Allies mobilized with the quiet efficiency of an underground river. Amos Miller, the trading post owner, spent his days visiting the other merchants. He didn't make speeches. He simply pointed out the economics of corruption. "Sheriff taxes your shipments," Amos told the blacksmith. "The preacher demands a tithe on goods he doesn't bless. If we let them crush this girl, they will know they can crush any of us." "Who is next? Your daughter? My wife?" Slowly, the sentiment in town began to shift. It wasn't open rebellion, but the nods were less friendly when the sheriff walked by. Silas Thorne, the clerk, sent telegram after telegram, badgering the circuit court to move faster. He found obscure precedents in dusty law books, preparing a defense for Caleb that would turn the assault charge into a joke. But it was Martha Gable, the midwife, who brought the darkest truth to light. 2 nights before the hearing, Martha came to the livery room. She brought a loaf of bread and a face grim with news. "I have been talking to the women," Martha said, sitting heavily on the single chair. "The ones who were sent away." "Sent away where?" Lydia asked. "Pouring tea." "Most were sent to the city," Martha said. "To brothels. The preacher has a cousin in Denver who runs a house. He gets a fee for every fallen woman he sends to be rehabilitated. But some were sent to cabins like yours." Lydia went cold. "Like mine?" "Remote places," Martha said. "Far from the roads. Places where a woman alone has no value but what a man can take from her. You weren't sent to Caleb's cabin to work off a debt. Lydia, you were sent there to disappear. They expected the winter to kill you, or for Caleb to use you and discard you. Either way, you were never meant to come back down that mountain. Lydia stared at the flickering candle. She felt a nausea rise in her throat. It wasn't just prejudice. It was trafficking. It was murder by geography. "They sold me," Lydia whispered. "To the cold. And now you have returned," Martha said. "You are the one thing they never planned for. A survivor." The desperation of the town council manifested the next afternoon in the form of a silk dress and a velvet hat. Mrs. Higgins, the preacher's wife, intercepted Lydia as she was leaving the livery. Mrs. Higgins was a woman who wore her piety like armor, but today her face was pale and sweating. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice tight. "A word." She pulled Lydia into the narrow space between the stable and the dry goods store. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is $200. "Mrs. Higgins said, shoving the envelope toward Lydia. "And a ticket on the afternoon stage to St. Louis. It leaves in 1 hour." Lydia looked at the money. It was more than she could earn in 5 years. It was freedom. It was a new life where no one knew her name. "Why?" Lydia asked. "My husband is concerned for your welfare," Mrs. Higgins said, her eyes darting around. "He feels the town has been unkind. He wants you to have a fresh start. Go to St. Louis. Find a husband. Forget Pine Hollow." Lydia looked at the woman's trembling hands. She realized then that the preacher didn't send the money out of charity. He sent it out of terror. "He is afraid," Lydia said. "He knows what I'm going to say tomorrow." "Take the money," Mrs. Higgins hissed. "You can't win against them. They will destroy you. Please take it and go. For your own sake." Lydia felt the temptation. It was a warm, golden tug. To run, to escape the stares, the danger, the terrifying prospect of standing in a courtroom. Then she thought of Caleb in his cell. She thought of Elspeth, silenced by fear. She thought of the women in the brothels in Denver. Lydia pushed the envelope back. "I am not for sale, Mrs. Higgins," Lydia said. "And neither is the truth. Tell your husband to save his money for a lawyer." She turned and walked away, leaving the preacher's wife staring at the mud. The day of the hearing dawned gray and blustery, the wind whipping the flags on Main Street. Judge Galloway had arrived the night before, a tall man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that missed nothing. He had ordered the town hall cleared for the proceedings, as the courthouse was too small for the crowd that had gathered. The entire town was there. Miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and wives packed the benches. They were hungry for spectacle, for blood. Lydia sat at a small table near the front. She wore her best dress, the gray wool she had mended 100 times. Her hair was pulled back tight. She sat alone. Caleb was still in the cell. The sheriff refused to bring him out until ordered by the judge. Reverend Higgins sat on the other side, flanked by Samuel Clay and Sheriff Barron. The preacher looked confident, his Bible resting on the table like a weapon. Samuel looked bored, picking at his fingernails. "All rise," Silas Thorne bellowed. Judge Galloway entered, his black robe sweeping the floor. He sat behind the high desk and surveyed the room. The silence was absolute. "I have read the complaint filed by Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice dry and authoritative. "It contains grave accusations against the leadership of this town. We will hear the matter of the theft first. Bring in the accused, Caleb Rourke." The side door opened. Caleb was led in by 2 deputies. He was in irons, but he walked with his head high. He looked at Lydia, a brief, burning glance that gave her the strength to breathe. The proceedings began. Silas Thorne presented the ledger. He showed the judge the pages where the numbers had been altered. He showed the note Lydia had found. "This note suggests premeditation, Your Honor," Thorne argued. "And the handwriting matches that of Deacon Weaver." "Weaver is dead," the sheriff barked out. "Died of a heart attack last winter. Convenient for you to blame a dead man." "We shall see," the judge said. "Call the witness, Lydia Hart." Lydia stood up. She walked to the stand. She felt the eyes of the town on her, hundreds of heavy, judging weights. She took the oath, her hand on the Bible. "Miss Hart," the judge said, "did you take the donation box?" "No, sir," Lydia said. Her voice was not loud, but it projected to the back of the room. "Did you entice Samuel Clay into the alley on the night in question?" "No, sir. I was delivering a dress. He followed me. He cornered me. He tried to force himself on me." A murmur ran through the crowd. Samuel Clay jumped up. "She is lying. She begged for it. She is a whore who lives with a savage." "Sit down, Mr. Clay," the judge slammed his gavel, "or I will hold you in contempt." Lydia turned to look at Samuel. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at him with a cool, detached pity. "He tore my dress," Lydia stated simply. "He bruised my arm. I struck him with my parasol to escape. If I had wanted his attention, I would not have had to fight for my life to get away from it." Her calmness unnerved them. They wanted hysteria. They wanted a weeping woman they could dismiss. Instead, they got a witness who spoke in facts. "Call Martha Gable," Thorne said. The midwife took the stand. She was nervous, twisting her handkerchief, but she looked at the preacher and found her anger. "I treated Lydia's arm," Martha testified. "The bruises were shaped like fingers, heavy fingers. And she is not the first. I treated Elspeth. I treated Sarah Miller before she was sent away. They all had the same marks, and they all had the same story. Samuel Clay, or the deacon, or men the sheriff protects." The room erupted. People were shouting. The preacher stood up, his face purple. "This is blasphemy! This woman is a bitter spinster spreading lies." "Sit down, Reverend," Judge Galloway roared. He turned his eyes to Samuel Clay. "Mr. Clay, step forward." Samuel walked to the front. He looked less bored now. He looked sweaty. "Mr. Clay," the judge said softly, "you say Miss Hart tempted you? How?" She looked at me," Samuel stammered. "She walked in a way. You know how they are." "I do not know how they are," the judge said coldly. "Explain it to me." "She wanted money," Samuel shouted, cracking under the pressure. "She owed everyone. She thought if she let me touch her, I'd pay her bills. But she got greedy. She tried to steal the box when I wouldn't pay." "So you admit you touched her?" the judge asked. Samuel froze. She let me." "Lydia Hart says she fought you," the judge said. "And the midwife says she had defensive bruises. That sounds like a woman who said no." Samuel's face twisted into a mask of ugly entitlement. "Who cares what she said? She is a nobody. My father owns this town. She is just a seamstress." The silence that followed was total. Samuel had just admitted that his power mattered more than her consent. "The law cares, Mr. Clay," the judge said. He turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff Barron, release Mr. Rourke. I want this boy in custody." Barron stood there, his hand on his gun. He looked at the preacher. He looked at the angry crowd, which was turning on him. He saw his control slipping away like sand. "No," Barron said. "Excuse me?" the judge said. "This court has no authority here." Barron shouted. "This is my town. Deputy, remove the girl. She is hysterical. Get her out." A deputy lunged for Lydia. Caleb, who had been standing by the defense table, snapped the chain of his handcuffs against the deputy's face. The man went down. "Lydia!" Caleb shouted. The courtroom exploded into chaos. From outside, a gunshot cracked, loud and booming. It was a signal. "Fire!" someone screamed. "The bank is on fire!" Panic seized the crowd. People stampeded toward the doors. In the confusion, Sheriff Barron grabbed the ledger from the clerk's table. He shoved Silas Thorne to the ground and bolted for the side exit. "He has the book!" Thorne yelled. "He is going to destroy the evidence!" Caleb grabbed the keys from the unconscious deputy's belt and unlocked his cuffs in one smooth motion. He looked for Lydia. She was already moving. She had grabbed the deputy's dropped pistol, but she tossed it aside. It was too heavy. She saw Barron running toward the back of the church. "Caleb!" she yelled. "The creek!" They burst out of the town hall into the muddy street. Smoke was rising from a barrel of tar set on fire near the bank. A crude distraction. They sprinted through the alley. Barron was ahead of them, splashing through the muck, clutching the ledger to his chest. He was heading for the creek, where the water would wash the ink away and destroy the proof of the theft forever. Lydia was faster than Caleb in the deep mud. She didn't have his weight sinking her down. She scrambled over a fence, tearing her dress, and cut across the churchyard. Barron reached the bank of the swollen creek. He raised the book to throw it in. "Stop!" Lydia stood 10 yards away. She had snatched her own Winchester from the saddlebag on Blue, who was tied at the hitching rail behind the church. She leveled the rifle. Barron froze. He turned slowly. He saw the woman he had called a victim, a whore, a nobody. She was covered in mud, her hair wild, her chest heaving, and the barrel of the rifle was steady as a rock. "Put the book down," Lydia said. "You won't shoot." Barron sneered. "You are a girl." "I am a mountain woman," Lydia corrected. "And I don't miss." Barron's eyes flicked to his own gun. He started to draw. Lydia shifted her aim. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for the mud by his boot. Crack! The bullet struck inches from his toe, spraying wet earth over his trousers. Barron jumped back, dropping the ledger. "The next one goes in your knee," Lydia warned. "Don't make me cripple you." Barron held his hands up, his face pale. Caleb crashed through the brush a second later, his chest heaving. He saw Lydia holding the sheriff at bay. He saw the ledger safe on the ground. He stopped. He didn't rush in to finish it. He let her hold the moment. He let her be the one who brought the law down. 4 U.S. Marshals, the judge's escort, came running around the corner, guns drawn. "Drop it, Barron!" the lead marshal shouted. Barron sagged. He let his gun belt fall into the mud. It was over. Lydia lowered the rifle. The strength that had held her upright suddenly vanished. Her knees buckled. She didn't hit the ground. Caleb was there. He caught her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her into him. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming release of terror. She shook violently. "I didn't shoot him," she gasped. "I wanted to, but I didn't." "I know," Caleb whispered into her hair. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth. It was a kiss of raw relief, tasting of salt and smoke. "You did it. You stopped him." The marshals were dragging Barron away. Silas Thorne ran up and retrieved the muddy ledger, clutching it like a newborn baby. Lydia pulled back slightly, looking up at Caleb. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "I want to go home," she whispered. "To the cabin?" Caleb asked. "No," she said. "I want to go somewhere where I don't have to hold a gun to feel safe. I want a life where desire isn't a punishment. Caleb, where loving you doesn't mean fighting a war." Caleb smoothed the hair back from her face. "And I want a life where your name is spoken with respect," he said. "We will find it, I promise." The aftermath was swift and brutal for the powerful men of Pine Hollow. Judge Galloway declared martial law until the investigation was complete. The ledger proved everything: the theft, the land deals, the bribes. Reverend Higgins was arrested in his pulpit the following Sunday. Sheriff Barron was shackled and sent to Laramie. Samuel Clay was taken into custody, weeping like the child he was. The town was in shock. The structure of their morality had been exposed as a rot. The women who had crossed the street to avoid Lydia now looked at the ground when she passed, ashamed. But Lydia and Caleb did not stay to watch the fall. 3 days later, the horses were packed. The town was quiet as they rode down Main Street. This time, no one jeered, no one spat. A few people, Amos Miller, Martha Gable, Elspeth, stood on the boardwalk and waved. Lydia did not look back at the church or the jail. She looked forward, toward the open trail that led out of the valley. "Where to?" Caleb asked, his voice light for the first time in years. Lydia looked at the vast, open horizon. "West," she said. "Somewhere new." They kicked their horses into a trot, leaving the shadows of Pine Hollow behind them, carrying scars that would never fully fade, but possessing a freedom that had been forged in the fire. The return to the high country was not a retreat, it was an ascent. When Caleb Rourke and Lydia Hart guided their horses back up the winding game trails that led to the timberline, the mountain did not loom over them as a threat. In November, the peaks had been jagged teeth waiting to chew them up. Now, in the full flush of late spring, the granite seemed to stand as a fortress wall, built to keep the madness of the world below at bay. The snow had retreated to the highest elevations, leaving behind meadows that were a riot of Indian paintbrush and blue columbine. The creek, which had been a frozen silence and then a raging flood, was now a steady, musical companion that ran clear over the stones. They arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. It stood exactly as they had left it, rough-hewn, solitary, tucked against the stone face of the cliff. But to Lydia, seeing the gray logs and the heavy shuttered window did not bring a sense of exile. It brought a profound exhalation of breath she felt she had been holding since they descended into Pine Hollow. "It needs a new roof," Caleb said, swinging down from his saddle. He looked at the structure with a critical, proprietorial eye. That storm in January loosened the shakes. "It needs a garden," Lydia countered, sliding off the mule. She looked at the patch of sun-drenched earth near the south wall. "And the door needs a latch that doesn't stick." They looked at each other across the backs of the horses. They were dirty, tired, and carrying the invisible weight of the trial, but there was a lightness in their eyes that mirrored the thin, clear air. "Home," Caleb said. It was not a question. "Home," Lydia agreed. The aftershocks of justice did not stop at the tree line, but they arrived slowly, carried by the occasional rider or the wind. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of the mountain reasserted itself, but it was a shared rhythm now. They did not just survive, they lived. In mid-June, a rider from the U.S. Marshal's office made the trek up the pass. He was a young man, respectful, who declined to dismount, but handed Caleb a thick envelope sealed with wax. "Judge Galloway wanted this placed in your hands personally," the marshal said. "He said to tell you the investigation is ongoing. The preacher has been removed from his pulpit. The church council is dissolved. They are finding money hidden in floorboards all over town." Caleb nodded, taking the envelope. "And Barron, state penitentiary," the marshal said. 10 years hard labor. He won't be wearing a badge again." The marshal tipped his hat to Lydia, a gesture of genuine respect, not the mocking courtesy she had known in town, and rode back down. That evening, by the light of the oil lamp, Lydia opened the envelope. Inside was a document stamped with the territorial seal. It was an official exoneration. "The charges of larceny against Lydia Hart are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The court acknowledges her status as a victim of conspiracy and extortion." It was just paper. It was ink and pulp. It could not undo the bruises on her arm or the nights she had spent shivering in fear. But as Lydia ran her fingers over the raised seal, she felt a heavy stone lift from her chest. "It is official," she said softly. "I am not a thief." Caleb was whittling by the fire. He stopped and looked at her. "You never were, but now the world knows it." He took the paper from her and placed it on the mantel, weighting it down with a river stone. It wasn't a trophy, it was a boundary marker. It stated that the lies stopped here. Healing, however, was not as tidy as a court document. The trauma of the winter and the trial lived in their bodies, a shadow that moved when they moved. It appeared in small, sharp moments that shattered the peace. One evening, Caleb dropped a heavy iron skillet onto the hearthstone. The clang was loud, metallic, and sudden. Lydia, who was sewing at the table, didn't just jump. She gasped, her body seizing up, her hands flying to protect her face. It was the reflex of a woman expecting a blow. The silence that followed was terrible. Caleb stood frozen, looking at her cowering posture. Lydia slowly lowered her hands, her face flushing with a mix of shame and frustration. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know it was just a pen." Caleb crossed the room. He didn't touch her immediately. He knelt down so he was lower than her, reducing his size. "Don't apologize," he said gently. "It is the memory. It has a long tail." "I hate it," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "I hate that they are still here, in my head. I want them gone." "We name it," Caleb said. "When the dreams come, or the flinch comes, we name it. We say, that is the past, and we wait for it to pass." Caleb had his own ghosts. He still woke in the dead of night, his skin cold, reaching for a wife and child who were not there. He would sit on the edge of the bed, his breathing ragged, convinced for a terrifying second that the cabin was silent because everyone he loved was dead. Lydia learned to recognize the shift in his breathing. She would reach out from under the quilt and place her hand flat on his back, between his shoulder blades. She wouldn't speak. She would just anchor him. "I am here. You are not alone." The fire is lit. Slowly, the flinches became fewer. The nightmares lost their teeth. They learned that healing was not about forgetting. It was about remembering without being destroyed. As summer deepened, they turned their energy to the cabin. It was time to stop patching a shelter and start building a home. They felled trees in the timber, Caleb swinging the axe with a rhythm that echoed off the cliffs, Lydia stripping the bark with a draw knife. They decided to add a room, a proper space for washing and storage, so the main room could be for living. The work was hard, sweating labor, but it was joyful. Every log they lifted into place was a declaration of permanence. Lydia found a patch of soil on the south side of the cabin that wasn't pure granite. She hauled river silt in buckets to enrich it. She planted potatoes, radishes, and a handful of wildflower seeds she had gathered in the lower meadows. "Radishes?" Caleb teased, watching her weed the small patch. "A man can't live on radishes." "A man will get scurvy if he only eats venison and flour," Lydia retorted, wiping dirt on her apron. "And besides, I like the red color. It looks cheerful." She made curtains for the windows. She used old flour sacks, bleaching them in the sun and stitching a border of blue thread she had bought at the trading post. They weren't silk, they weren't velvet. But when the morning sun hit them, filling the cabin with a soft, diffused light, Lydia thought they were the most beautiful things she had ever seen. They were hers. One rainy afternoon in July, Lydia came inside from gathering wood to find Caleb sitting on his bench, working on a piece of pine with his fine chisels. He was shaping something curved, hollow. She watched him for a moment, the shavings curling onto the floor. It was a rocker, a cradle rocker. The air in the room went still. Caleb stopped carving. He didn't look up. "I am not assuming anything," he said, his voice gruff. "And I am not asking for anything, but the wood was good, straight grain." Lydia walked over to him. She looked at the cradle. It was small, delicate, carved with a care that spoke of a heart breaking open. Caleb had lost a child in this cabin. For years, the idea of a child had been a source of agony, a reminder of his failure. Now, he was carving a place for a future. He was no longer afraid to imagine a life that continued. Lydia placed her hand on his shoulder. "It is beautiful. Caleb." He looked up at her, his eyes wet. "I thought I buried this part of me," he admitted. "Nothing stays buried forever," Lydia said. "Not if you let the light in." Their love grew like the garden, rooted in rocky soil, but fierce and resilient. The desperate, clinging intimacy of the flight from Pine Hollow settled into something deeper, warmer, and infinitely more satisfying. It was a romance built on the absolute luxury of safety. Lydia found a new boldness in herself. She learned that she could want without feeling like she owed a debt. She initiated affection, coming up behind him while he washed dishes to wrap her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his back. "You are wet," Caleb would grumble, though he would lean back into her, solid as a tree. "I am affectionate," she would correct. Their nights became a sanctuary within a sanctuary. The darkness of the cabin was no longer a place to hide, but a private world. Caleb learned to touch her not just with protectiveness, but with need. He learned that he could love her fiercely without the paralyzing fear that she would vanish by morning. There were stolen kisses while they hauled water from the creek, the bucket splashing as he pulled her in. There were long, quiet evenings by the fire where he would brush her hair, his large, rough hands handling the strands like silk. And in the bed, beneath the wedding ring quilt, their desire was a conversation. It was tender, hungry, and grounded in the absolute certainty of consent. "Is this all right?" his touch would ask. "Yes," her arching back would answer. "More." It was a reclaiming. Every time they came together, they erased a little more of the shame the town had tried to write on their skins. They proved that desire was not a trap, but a gift. But the world outside had one last gasp of venom to expel. It came in August, during the heat of the day. Caleb was up on the roof, replacing the last of the shakes. Lydia was by the creek, washing clothes. She heard the snap of a twig. It wasn't the heavy crack of a deer, but the stealthy sound of a boot trying to be quiet. Lydia didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She reached into her laundry basket and pulled out the pistol she still kept wrapped in a towel. She moved behind the cover of a large boulder. She peered out. A man was moving through the trees. He was dirty, unshaven, and he carried a rifle. She recognized him. It was one of Barron's former deputies, a man named Skinner who had fled before the marshals arrived. He looked gaunt, desperate, and his eyes were fixed on the cabin roof where Caleb's back was turned. He was hunting. Lydia felt a cold rage wash over her. Not fear, rage. This man had come to her home to bring death back to her doorstep. She could have shot him. She had the angle. She had the skill now. But she remembered her promise to Caleb. "Don't become their kind of man." She whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the air. Skinner spun around, his rifle swinging toward the creek. "Caleb!" Lydia shouted. 3 o'clock! The timber!" Caleb didn't look. He rolled. He slid down the steep pitch of the roof, dropping off the backside, disappearing from Skinner's sight line. Skinner panicked. He was exposed. He ran toward the corner of the cabin, trying to find cover. Lydia moved. She flanked him, keeping the boulder between them. Skinner rounded the corner of the cabin and ran straight into Caleb Rourke. Caleb didn't have a gun. He had a hammer, but he didn't swing it. He stepped inside Skinner's guard, grabbed the barrel of the rifle with one hand, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. Skinner went down hard. The wind knocked out of him. Caleb ripped the rifle from his hands and tossed it into the weeds. Skinner scrambled back. Reaching for a knife in his boot, Lydia stepped out from the bushes, her pistol leveled at his head. "Don't!" she said. Her voice was ice. Skinner froze. He looked at Caleb, towering over him, and Lydia, steady with the gun. He saw two people who were not prey. I just wanted," Skinner stammered. "Revenge?" Caleb asked. "Barron is in prison. You are starving in the woods. Is it worth dying for?" Skinner slumped. The fight went out of him. He was just a broken man following orders that no longer existed. "Get up," Caleb said. "They didn't kill him. They didn't beat him. They tied his hands and sat him on the porch." Lydia gave him water and a piece of bread. "Why?" Skinner asked, watching Lydia bandage a scrape on his arm. "I came to kill him." "Because we aren't you," Lydia said. "And we aren't Barron. We are free." 2 days later, they marched him down to the trading post and handed him over to Amos Miller to hold for the marshals. It was the final victory. They had faced violence and chosen justice. That autumn, the aspen trees turned to gold, setting the mountains on fire with color. Lydia and Caleb sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the peaks. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and frost. "Do you think I will ever be accepted?" Lydia asked suddenly. She was thinking of the letter Martha had sent. It said women were speaking up, yes, but it also said the town still whispered, that Lydia was a hero to some, but a scandal to others. Caleb took his pipe out of his mouth. He looked at her. "Acceptance is a small thing. Lydia," he said. "It means fitting into a shape someone else made. It means asking permission to exist." He reached out and took her hand. "Freedom is bigger," he said. "Freedom is making your own shape. I would rather be hated by that whole town while standing here with you than be loved by them and be alone in a crowd." Lydia squeezed his hand. She looked at the scar on his knuckle. "Hated together," she mused. I like the sound of that. Besides, Caleb added, a rare grin touching his beard, the Millers like us, and the midwife, and that girl, Elspeth. The best people know the truth. The rest don't matter. Community did find them, in small glimmers. Amos Miller rode up with supplies before the first snow, bringing a bolt of flannel for Lydia and a bag of sugar. Martha sent another letter, telling Lydia that Elspeth had found a job at the trading post and was learning to read. Lydia realized she hadn't just saved herself. Her refusal to be silent had kicked open a door for others. The final resolution came on a day when the wind was howling out of the north, a true winter gale arriving early. Lydia felt the need to go up, to the high ridge above the cabin. She put on her coat and wrapped a scarf around her head. She climbed the rocky slope until she stood on the spine of the mountain. The wind here was ferocious. It tore at her clothes, stinging her cheeks. She looked out over the endless sea of peaks, white, gray, and blue. It was a landscape that didn't care about money, or reputation, or the morals of small men. Lydia opened her mouth. She shouted into the wind, "I am not unwanted." The wind snatched the words away. "I am not a sin. I am not a debt. I am Lydia." She screamed out the shame of the last year. She screamed out the memory of Samuel's hands, the preacher's voice, the sheriff's eyes. She let the wind scour her clean. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Caleb was there. He didn't tell her to hush. He stood beside her, bracing himself against the gale. "Tell them," Caleb roared into the canyon. "Tell them all to go to hell?" Lydia laughed. It was a wild, free sound. She grabbed his hand. "We are here," she shouted. "And we are staying." They stood shoulder to shoulder, two specks against the vastness of the American West, defying the silence. Night fell early. The wind died down, leaving a hush over the valley. Inside the cabin, the fire was banking low, casting a warm, orange glow against the log walls. The new curtains were drawn. The smell of stew and coffee filled the air. Lydia sat in the rocking chair, her feet tucked under her. Caleb sat on the rug near the hearth, oiling his boots. There was no need for words. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was filled with the knowledge that the larder was full. The roof was sound, and the door was barred against the cold. They carried scars. Lydia still checked the horizon when she went outside. Caleb still checked the load in his rifle before he slept. They would always be watchful. They would always be survivors. But they were no longer alone. Caleb looked up from his work. He caught Lydia's eye. He smiled, a slow, easy expression that reached his eyes. Lydia smiled back. She reached out and touched the side of his face. Outside, the snow began to fall, blanketing the pass in white. But inside, the firelight danced in the window, framing the silhouettes of a man and a woman moving close to one another, safe in a world they had built with their own hands, a world that could not reach them as easily anymore. Thank you for listening to Town Sent Unwanted Maiden to Mountain Man's cabin. What he saw in her changed everything. It has been a journey through the hardship, resilience, and redeeming love of the American frontier. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If this story touched you, or if you enjoy tales of the Wild West that explore the grit and heart of history, please subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts on Lydia and Caleb's journey in the comments in English. Did their justice feel earned? What did you think of their choice to return to the mountains? I look forward to reading your reflections. Until the next story, keep the fire lit.